Hello and welcome to WorldCanvass from International Programs at the University of Iowa. I'm Joan Kerr. We're coming to you from Film Scene in downtown Iowa City, and we're happy to have you join us for part 3 of this series on the Arab Spring in a global context. In this final segment, we'll be trying to understand where we are now, 5 years after the start of what we're calling the Arab Spring. What's the impact in the region and in the West, and what does it mean for the future of U.S. foreign policy? Before we start, I want to invite you to join us for these live programs if you can, or catch them later on UITV, YouTube, or iTunes. Information about upcoming shows, as well as links to archived programs, can be found at international.uiowa.edu. And you can learn more about Film Scene at icfilmscene.org. A reminder that this program is part of the Provost Global Forum for 2015, a series of events happening all week long here in Iowa City, and they're all open to the public, so we hope you can join us for many of these events. You can find a full schedule at international.uiowa.edu. Our very special guests for this segment are Juan Cole and Shibley Telhami. Mr. Cole is just next to me here. He's the Richard P. Mitchell Collegiate Professor of History at the University of Michigan. For 3.5 decades, he's sought to put the relationship of the West and the Muslim world in historical context. His most recent book is The New Arabs: How the Millennial Generation is Changing the Middle East. He also authored Engaging the Muslim World, Napoleon's Egypt, Invading the Middle East, and many other books. Dr. Cole has written widely about upheavals in the Arab world since 2011. He's written about Sunni extremist groups and about Shiite politics. He's a well-known commentator on Middle Eastern issues and has a regular column at Truth Dig. Dr. Cole commands Arabic, Persian, and Urdu, and reads Turkish. And it's a great pleasure to have you here this afternoon, Dr. Cole. Dr. Shibley Telhami is at the far end of our panel here. He is the Anwar Sadat Professor for Peace and Development at the University of Maryland and a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. Dr. Telhami has served as an advisor to the U.S. mission to the UN, an advisor to former Congressman Lee Hamilton, and senior advisor to the U.S. Special Envoy George Mitchell. His best-selling book, The Stakes, America and the Middle East, was selected by Foreign Affairs as one of the top 5 books on the Middle East in 2003. In addition, his most recent book, The World Through Arab Eyes, Arab Public Opinion and the Reshaping of the Middle East, was published in 2013. Dr. Telhami was selected by the Carnegie Corporation of New York, along with the New York Times, as one of the great immigrants for 2013. Dr. Telhami is also a recipient of the University of Maryland's Honors College 2014 Outstanding Faculty Award. A pleasure to have you here with us this afternoon. You've heard the first 2 segments of this program. Lots of discussion going on this weekend, every day, on what's happening in the Middle East and in the last 5 years or so. I'll turn to you first, Juan, and ask you, how could we begin to assess the global impact of these last 5 years of what's been called the Arab Spring or the Dignity Revolution?
Well, I'm very interested in the young people who made these revolutions and came out in the streets, deployed new kinds of politics. For instance, this idea of just setting up tents and staying in the downtown area of a major city near to the presidential palace, near to the centers of power, which is a kind of threat. It's a kind of blackmail on the elite. Nothing's going to get done. We're not going home until things change. In fact, towards the end, because in Egypt in 2011, this thing lasted for several weeks, the young people were holding up signs, Mubarak, leave, I need a shower. They were camped out. These techniques have been taken up all over the world, and in places and in ways that I think we don't always attend to in the United States. But for instance, in Chile, there's been a big student movement demanding free education, which is now something that President Obama has started to talk about in this country, but pushing back against marketizing education, student debt, and so forth. And there have been huge demonstrations in Chile, and they have explicitly instanced having seen the Tahrir Square demonstrations in Egypt as an inspiration to them. Or in Brazil, young people have protested over transportation costs and have challenged the government on important infrastructural questions. And again, for them, you know, if you can't get to your work, if it's too expensive, and so this is a matter of dignity. In Spain, also there has been a whole movement called the indignados, the indignant ones. And they went to Egypt and consulted with the young people to get ideas how to challenge their government, again, over issues in the cost of education and employment and so forth. And in Turkey, we saw with the Gezi Park demonstrations, and that was a demonstration that the government was going to take away public space, parks and recreational areas that young people use, and turn it into a mall. And so it was a protest against too much, consumer culture and so forth. And this became, in Turkey, a nationwide movement a couple years ago. Again, very clearly influenced by what the Arab youth had accomplished and the techniques that they deployed and so forth. So this thing has gone all over the world, and of course we have to mention Occupy Wall Street in this country, which also some of the people who initially began it and called for a demonstration on September 17th talked about what they had seen of the Arab youth's activities.
Dr. Telhami, let me ask you the same question. How do we begin to look at this whole complex of events and draw some major assessments from it?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me.
You're welcome.
I'm happy to be in Iowa when the weather is beautiful and around the corner all the presidential candidates have camped out. So, happy to be here. I think, first of all, we really need to differentiate. When we look at the Middle East now, and we're seeing all these upheavals, almost in every corner, we sort of link it all up to the Arab uprisings. And frankly, that's a mistake. We need to start by differentiating that which is linked to the Arab uprisings and that which is not. Let me give you an example. When you ask Americans today, what is the biggest threat facing the United States in the Middle East today? They don't tell you it's Libya. They don't tell you it's Yemen. They don't tell you even it's Iran. They say it's ISIS. They say it's the Islamic State. Well, the Islamic State, whether it's true that it's number one threat or not objective, that's another story, but the perception. The Islamic State, in my own mind, is far more a product of the 2003 Iraq War than it is a product of the Arab uprisings. And so a lot of the upheavals that we're seeing, or a lot of the trouble that we're seeing, particularly linked to the rise of ISIS itself in Iraq and Syria, is more linked to this war that has been devastating and had disastrous consequences over the decade, certainly with added fuel coming from the Arab uprising. So we need to, first of all, keep conceptual separation. Not everything that is happening is linked to the Arab uprisings. Second, if you look at how the international community, both at the level of publics and at the level of governments, viewed the Arab uprisings, you have to say there has been an evolving trend. It's not identical. Let's start with the assumption that was here in America. Historically, American foreign policy has preferred what was called stability in the region. We're sort of more operated on a realist paradigm. And then when Bush started the 2003 war, linked it up to this idea of democracy, and then there was this whole new idea that maybe instability is a good thing. And well, it's when the uprising started, and they started peacefully, Ben Ali in Tunisia was overthrown very quickly. Mubarak, no one thought that could happen. He even didn't think so. He said, I'm not like Ben Ali. He was overthrown very quickly. And then it started up in Libya and elsewhere. And you can see even the immediate change of policy by the international community. You started seeing it in day one from France. France initially took a position in favor of Ben Ali. The foreign minister of France actually spoke on behalf of Ben Ali, so much so that when he was overthrown, she was removed from office by the president, and the president overcompensated by jumping on the bandwagon of the Arab revolutions to the point of becoming the biggest advocate of intervention in Libya to overthrow Gaddafi. So, and you can see even with President Obama. President Obama is, if you can argue, when he came to office, he was much more of a realist about foreign policy. I would even argue that his kind of if you had a model for effective administration, it was Bush Sr. And if you had a model for a team, it was a team like the one led by Brent Scowcroft of the Bush White House. So he comes in less enamored by the rhetoric of the Bush administration and more going to fix relations with the Muslim world, pull out of Iraq, but still make deal with regimes. He gave his big speech to the Arab world standing next to President Mubarak. He went on his first trip to talk to the King of Saudi Arabia. But when it looked like there was a wave of unstoppable wave of public power, people power, mostly peaceful, not ideological, successful, no one wanted to be on the wrong side of history. And everybody jumped on that bandwagon, and I think rightly so. I think rightly so, because I think no one should be on the wrong side, even if it didn't have much of a chance in some places. But nonetheless, we see a reversal now, because I think even President Obama says that the intervention in Libya may have been one of his mistakes. You can see that the events that happen in Egypt, and certainly what's happening in Syria and what's happening in Yemen, has, I think, had a lot of countries, a lot of people revert to, in a way, the old habits, which is let's find stable leaders and support them. Yeah, we don't like it. Let's hold our noses and still do it anyway because that's in our interest. So we're back in a way. We still have hope, but we're back in that same mode. Interestingly, that even is true with public opinion, because I have been polling on this here in the American arena, American public opinion, on how they saw the Arab uprising. So right after Mubarak was overthrown, we asked, is this, how do you see the Arab uprising? Are they more about Islamic groups trying to take power? Are they more about people who want freedom and democracy like you? And it was more the latter than the former. So we had more people say it's about democracy and freedom. In fact, fascinating, when you ask them about the views of Arabs broadly, Americans suddenly had a positive view of Arabs. And of Egyptians, right after Mubarak was overthrown, 70% of Americans had a positive view of Egyptians. So they saw this public empowerment. People were not chanting slogans, death to America. They said, we want freedom, we want dignity, and so they were embraced. And when you ask people, do you want the United States to support democracy, even if it leads to the election of governments that are not pro-American? A majority of Americans said yes. Yeah. People were inspired by it. It has reversed in the past couple of years, in part because of the rise initially of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, the anarchy that has resulted, and I think the public too is back on the side of caution and stability instead of being inspired and jumping on the bandwagon. I would say that has been kind of the trend globally, not just here.
Do you see it the same way, Juan?
Well, I guess I'm looking at it at a different level. At the level of geopolitics, great powers always like the status quo. Very inconvenient for a great power for things to change. They have made deals, they have clients. The President of the United States for nearly 30 years could call up Hosni Mubarak and say, Hosni, we need you to do something about the Suez Canal. We need you to do this, that, or the other thing. He would say, yes, sir. So when he's gone and you have to deal with a succession of various actors and their elections, and we don't know who's going to be in parliament, that's not nearly as convenient for a great power. So I really wouldn't put too much emphasis on what Washington wants. Washington would always like things to stay as they are. What really strikes me is that these young people, and most of this upheaval has been provoked by people in their 20s. They weren't even, alive when Hosni Mubarak came to power, a lot of them. So they are putting down a marker on social change. Now, Americans tend to look at this as an issue of transition from dictatorship to democracy. And that's kind of the great American narrative, along with, you know, Horatio Alger and picking yourself up by your bootstraps and getting to be wealthy after you had been poor. So how great it would be if the Arabs could do both, you know, move to democracy and pick themselves up and so forth. But for the young people on the streets, the young people who made these revolutions and who continue to be active, this is about something else. It's about, as Professor Sawaya said, about dignity. It is about social justice. It's about the compact between the government and the people. And one of the things that they were most upset about, which, you know, it wasn't an issue that I think the American public really understood, was that these Republican, with a small r, they were not monarchies, they were republics. These Republican governments were being ruled by presidents for life who were becoming kings. And they were going to pass these governments over to their sons. Saif Gaddafi was going to get Libya, and Gamal Mubarak was going to get Egypt, and what's going on in Yemen is still a little bit about whether Ali Abdullah Saleh's son is going to get Yemen, and so forth. And they were going to be inherited like so many sticks of furniture. And that was one of the major reasons that they mobilized. They said, no, we're not going to be inherited. These are republics. We are citizens. And so there was a movement in Egypt about Gamal Mubarak. You know, they said that when he was kind of a playboy. He got married late. And when he finally got married, he kind of married a woman who was very fashionable. Her name was Khadija, or is Khadija. And so there was a whole campaign of these young people in Egypt that they wrote the Ministry of Interior. They said, we want to have parties to celebrate Gamal getting married. And the theme of the party would be Khadija, yes, Egypt, no. You can have Khadija, you can't have Egypt. And so, you know, again, this was about a compact that the Republican regimes had made with people, that republics are about, to some extent, popular sovereignty, and that was what was being denied. And I just want to point out that you know, revolutions are full of turmoil. And we forget now, in the United States, in the 13 colonies, a third of the population was chased out of here. They're now Canadians. And so it wasn't pleasant. You know, lots of horrible things happened. And the same in the French Revolution in the 1790s. We all know about the terror and the peasant revolts. And I mean, really, 100,000 people probably died and all that. So Americans, I think, don't have a strong sense sometimes of the details of history. So when you announce you're going to have a revolution, this is not nice. You know, this is not necessarily going to go smoothly. There's going to be a lot of turmoil and so forth. But the question is, what are people fighting for? And even in Egypt, where you've had a reassertion of the military without any doubt, the Egyptian constitution now says that there's term limits on the president. And I personally don't think that that can easily be overcome. And I was in Egypt last year this time. The labor unions were all striking. Even the postal workers, and in Egypt still, you know, a lot of business gets done by the post office, so that's terrible for the economy. The postal workers are striking. And in the old days, under Mubarak, these ninja-looking police would come in and they would make the workers work. They would bring them to the factory and point guns at them and say, work, no strikes. But in this case, a year ago, the government said, well, why are you unhappy? What are you striking about? What could we do for you? Because they needed them at that point. The government is not nearly as strong now as it used to be. So when people say that, you know, we're right back to where we were, that's not entirely true. I don't want to deny that there's been a retrenchment of authoritarianism, but we're not right back to where we were. And people also know now how to mobilize. They haven't forgotten. And maybe they're tired. There's been a lot of change. Maybe some of the changes were unwelcome. A lot of Egyptians were not happy about the Muslim Brotherhood year in Egypt. And of course, in some countries, like Libya, there's substantial social turmoil and faction fighting. But I think that these young people are riding a tiger, and they have these insistences on a set of new social compacts, which haven't gone away. This thing is not over with.
I certainly agree that this thing is not over with and we're not back to authoritarianism the old way. I agree with that. I think what's important, though, is to just try to tease out, so what did the Arab uprisings introduce? What is this public empowerment? And how does it interact with other sources of power? And that way you can get a little bit handle on how things are working out. My own view, I think the plight for dignity is not new. Arabs have always wanted dignity. It's important for them. There was not even anything particularly surprising about the Arab economies in 2010, 2011 that you say they haven't experienced in the past 20 years. So I think that, and we were never surprised. We, as political scientists or historians or students of the Middle East, always knew that there was a huge gap between publics and governments. We knew governments were not popular. We knew that if publics had a choice, they would revolt. I had been doing public opinion polls in the Arab world for 10 years before. Every year I'd say the gap is widening between people and government. So our puzzle as specialists wasn't really sort of about the gap. It was more about, why don't these people revolt? And we had an answer for that. And the answer was, it's not enough to have a lot of angry people to revolt, because they need to mobilize in large numbers in an effective way to make a difference. And for that, you need either political parties or social organizations, charismatic leadership to be able to mobilize the public. And governments, of course, understood that. They chopped head. They made sure that no one emerged that can organize. And they were comfortable with that. So when the Arab uprising started, the surprise was they happened initially without the need for major political organization or charismatic leadership. And so the principal element has been essentially the information revolution. And I think that information revolution does add an element that's with us to stay. It's an empowerment of the public in the Arab world, particularly the young people, on a scale we had never witnessed before. And that is a dynamic, that is a long-term dynamic. It's not something that can be put backward, because that's only expanding. That information revolution means that no government can have monopoly on information. It means that you have the kind of organization that our two experts before spoke about, where people could mobilize on large numbers when they need to. And so for that reason, I often compare it, actually, in a very different way, but compare it nonetheless with the Industrial Revolution in the West, where you've had a new dynamic brought about by the industry that empowered individuals through earning wages, that challenged existing political orders and social institutions. The information revolution is not doing it in the same way, but it's doing it nonetheless. So in that sense, we have a dynamic element. That dynamic element is no dictator can put it away anymore. They have to deal with it. But here's the thing. Okay, so it's wrong to think all people want the same thing. And so the fact that you have an empowered public, it's not just public against governments, it's publics against publics. And so that's the problem. The less central authority you have, by virtue of empowering publics, you have weakened central authority by default, even in the best circumstance. And you're going to have empowered publics. You're going to have the ultra-religious and the ultra-liberal empowered. You're going to have the Sunni, and you're going to have the Shia, and you're going to have the Arab, and you're going to have the Kurd. You're going to have the rich, and you're going to have the poor, and you're going to have everyone who wants anything empowered. That is not necessarily something that is stabilizing or something that brings people all together necessarily against a single central authority, where you say it's people versus government. Take Syria. Syria was for sure in part public against government. You had an authoritarian ruler being challenged by a public uprising, and that's why a lot of people were inspired. But it's far more complicated than that. We see you end up having not only people fearing each other. When the Muslim Brotherhood takes control, seculars start being worried, Shias start being worried, Christians start being worried, Druze start being worried, and rulers, not only rulers can use them, but as central authority weakens, you have a lot of international players who have a stake who come in. So in Syria, you have the Iranians, and you have the Saudis, and you have Hezbollah, and you have the United States, and you have Russia. And so, just to mention a few, that doesn't, go through it. So it's very complicated, to put it mildly. So the fact that you have it doesn't, let's take Egypt. So you don't need sectarianism to have divide. Look at. I mean, Egypt is overwhelmingly Sunni Muslim. They're 10% Christians, but it's overwhelmingly Sunni Muslim. So the fight is between Sunnis. It's not a fight between, it's not a sectarian fight. And it's about power, and it's about the nature of Egypt. And the fact that you have the public now as a new element that everybody has to take account of doesn't mean that the old sources of power go away. So the militaries that happen to be, and by the way, in every country where you had an Arab uprising, you can't understand either the beginning of it, the middle of it, the outcome of it, and the consequence of it without understanding the role of the military. Every single one of them, because frankly, the two relatively successful in the early days cases, Tunisia and Egypt, it was a decision by the military to sacrifice the presidents to preserve themselves. So those are not going to go away. They're only going to try to figure out how to deal with this empowerment. So that's why I'm saying, yes, it's a new dynamic, but it's not necessarily a predictable dynamic. In the short term, it's not necessarily even a happy one.
In the last couple of minutes, Juan, imagine you're being asked by President Obama to give him some advice on what should I be doing now in the Middle East? What should the U.S. be doing? In 2 minutes or less, please tell us what we should be doing next.
My main advice to President Obama is to get a policy, because as far as I can tell, he's all over the place. First, Hosni Mubarak, we're sure it's a stable regime. God forbid he's not a dictator. Now he has to go. Then we're all for, elected government of Mohammed Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood, and we tell the generals don't overthrow them and so forth. Then they overthrow them. We say, well, we're going to cut off your aid. Then after a while, we said, well, we decided not to cut off your aid. What is that? I mean, when I used to go to Egypt after the revolution, people were happy to see me because Obama encouraged Mubarak to step down. They said the Americans promote democracy. Now I go, everybody hates me. The Muslim Brotherhood thinks that I overthrew their president, and then the people who support the military think that I was supporting the Muslim Brotherhood. And you have people coming on TV saying that an American plot to install fundamentalism in Egypt and then also partition the country has been foiled by the Egyptian military. And I think, well, what were we going to partition it into? The upper and lower kingdom? I mean, just crazy things are being said. But it results from, in my view, the American government just being inconsistent and being all over the place. And I understand it's a difficult tiger to ride. But then in Libya, first he didn't want anything to do with it, Obama, and then he called it a turd sandwich, very unwelcome to get involved in Libya after he'd gotten out of Iraq. And then Hillary Clinton and Samantha Powers and Susan Rice convinced him he had to go in and save people from being massacred, which they would have been. And then, but after he bombed Libya and helped the rebels come to power, then did we form an army? Don't you think they might need one? If you overthrow their government, don't you owe them that? We just walked away. And then after that Benghazi incident occurred, the horrible thing where the U.S. ambassador was killed, and then the Congress was very irresponsible too. So they decided to stick it to Obama by having, I don't know, 3,000 hearings about Benghazi, and I think they're still going on. And what did was to make the State Department nervous about being involved in these countries. So the staff at the embassy in Tunisia came to me when I was in the country one time and said, please, blog about this, tell the American people, we're down to a skeleton crew, and they took out the dependents from Tunisia. There's nothing going on in Tunisia, and we can't do our jobs. And of course, the U.S. ambassador to Libya for some time now has been based in Malta and so forth. So I perceive Obama to be all over the place, intervening here, not intervening there, walking away from things, changing. I don't see a policy here. I think he would like really just to forget the whole region and go off and do trade deals with the Philippines and South Korea. And you know, he's from Hawaii, so it's the Pacific that attracts him. So I would say, get a policy.
You know, I'm a little kinder to the administration, and not because I agree with everything. I've actually been critical, and I've written critically about many of the things that they're doing. But here's why I'm a little kinder. I don't think we're in a position to do much in the Middle East. I think these events are not about America, and they're not going to be, they cannot be addressed by an American, major American role. And I think the president, to give him credit, he understood that in the first place, this is not about the U.S., don't make them about the U.S. And secondarily, the more active American intervention is likely to make things worse, not better. And third, that no matter what you do, you're going to be blamed because America has a legacy. And that legacy is linked to decades of behavior, not what it's doing now, or what's did yesterday, or what's going to do tomorrow. It has to do with mistrust in the region, linked to a number of issues, but certainly in the past 2 decades, mostly to Israel, Palestine, and Iraq, things that are very difficult to alter in people's perception. And for that reason, you know, even if we were to intervene for genuinely humanitarian reasons in a place like Syria over the chemical weapons issue, and I think the next morning, the very same people who are urging the U.S. to intervene would say, we're doing it for imperialist reasons. So I think the less we do, the better. This has been the president's policy. He wants to engage. He doesn't want to get dragged into another war. He wanted to get out of a disastrous Iraq war. He sees a deal with Iran as something that could also prevent additional involvement for the U.S. And everything else becomes a corollary, where you have to do a little bit of this and a little bit of that because you have too many interests you cannot avoid dealing with. You can't have necessarily a consistent policy over them. Whether you like the Egyptian military, they are in power. They are addressing issues that you worry about, including militant Islamist groups. There is an issue about maintaining the relationship between Egypt and Israel. And so he's, in some ways, if this were his top priority issue, he may have dealt with it in a different way. But since it's not his top priority issue, he's going to have to do the minimum to just keep it in line so it doesn't disrupt his other priorities. So I think they see their priority number one right now as a deal with Iran, and I think that's a legitimate priority for the president at this time. And they see the second priority as addressing the ISIS threat because it has consequences for both Syria and Iraq. And maybe down the road, if he has still any bandwidth, he may want to take one more try on the Israel-Palestine question. So I think everything else becomes secondary. And so I'm not surprised that a superpowers policy becomes somewhat inconsistent. And these are, of course, times when none of us can predict the outcome. Talking about uncertainty, as Walid was talking earlier in a different segment, I would never be in a position to predict what's going to happen in Syria tomorrow, or what's going to happen even in Egypt in 5 years from now, or what's going to happen in Libya in 2 years from now. There are too many moving parts. I could tell you about it, if-then kind of analysis, but I would not, and if you can't do that, to bet on certain outcomes in policy would be a mistake. And so for that reason, I'm a little kinder to the president.
Could I just clarify? I'm not in favor of interventions.
Okay.
I'm more impatient with inconsistency.
Well, thank you very much, Juan Cole and Shibley Telhami. Real pleasure to have you both here. And I know you'll both be speaking later during the symposium on the Arab Spring in a global context. Really interesting week ahead of us all here, and I hope you can take advantage of many of these events. So once again, Shibley Telhami and Juan Cole have been with us in this segment. This is WorldCanvass. If you'd like to watch any of these programs, they'll be posted on UITV TV, on YouTube. You can hear them also through the International Program's website, and we have a podcast on iTunes, so lots of places where you can hear this conversation all over again. We hope you will join us for the next World Canvas, which is next week, in fact, next Tuesday here in this room. And the topic is film and its ability to sort of enchant our imaginations and lead us into deeply personal adventures in unknown parts of the world. And that's next week. We hope you can join us. We'll have some students who've been in very interesting study abroad experiences. And also we'll talk to some of the organizers here at Film Scene about what they believe is important about international film. So join us for that if you can. Thank you for being with us, and good night.